in the future, which is part of Pint of Science Australia. Now, we're in for a fantastic night tonight, so thank you all for joining us wherever you find yourself in Australia, whether that's sitting at home on your couch or in your own favourite pub, dialing in. So we're going to be doing this on YouTube, which is probably where you find us. Now, this is an interactive event. You are not at a Zoom call. You are not part of a work meeting at 8:30 on a Monday. This is meant to be fun. It's meant to be relaxed. And importantly, it's meant to be interactive. So what does that mean? It means we would love to hear your questions, your thoughts, your ideas as part of this session. Now, the way that you do that is by typing in your questions in the comments beneath the video stream. Or you can use Twitter as well with the hashtag PintAU21. Now, in that context, AU, of course, is the symbol for gold because tonight's session is going to be nothing but gold. So just to recap what that hashtag is, it's hashtag PintAU21. Now, when we hold these events at pubs around Australia, we always ensure that we recognise the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and, the ones that make up the continent that we now call Australia. Today's a bit different, of course, because we're holding this event online and our speakers and much of our audience are streaming from all around Australia. So we'd like to acknowledge all traditional custodians of country who are the first innovators and scientists of this land. And we pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, emerging, and recognise their continuing relationship with land, waters and culture. So folks, my name's Julian O'Shea. I'm going to be the MC for tonight. I've got myself my beer. Now, it's unbranded because we haven't yet got a beer sponsor, but if you do work for a brewery and would like to sponsor Pint of Science in the future, please do get in contact. I also, on the other side, have a more restrained drink. So depending how it will go, I can choose my drink to match the mood. So as mentioned, my name's Julian. Now, I am a scientist. I'm an engineer. I'm also a designer. I came from the background of electronics engineering, and these days I'm doing my doctoral research at Monash University, exploring sustainability and sustainable transport. Now, I'm not the expert here. We've got some fantastic people who will be joining us tonight to share some insights about what food is like today and what food will be like into the future. Because tonight we are talking about a topic that affects literally everyone. We all have to eat, and we all have to eat something. Now, we have our favourite foods and cuisines, our comfort foods, our childhood memories, and probably our guilty consciences to know that we probably should be eating a bit better. We should be eating a bit, we should be getting a bit more fit, and we're probably, now that it's the 24th of May, pretty confident that a lot of people's New Year's resolutions have gone by the wayside. Now, we are living in a time when food is available 24/7. You can sit on your couch, scroll through an app and get food delivered to your door from hundreds of countries. Now, part of it is highly processed and packaged, so not all of it is great for us. Now, this evening, we're going to showcase the work of 4 brilliant scientists who are serving up innovative approaches for what food will look like in the future. Now, we're going to be asking questions around how we can be healthier, fitter and happier by eating a proper diet. We're going to be exploring the current production and consumption of food. And interestingly, what kind of ways that what we eat impacts us, our surroundings, and even the planet. So we're going to be delving into these questions, but importantly, you are there to ask your own questions. So to recap, you can put your questions into the live stream right now and on Twitter using the hashtag PintAU21. So let's see who we've got on this awesome panel tonight. And we've got a lot of talent, so you should be excited because I certainly am. First up, we have David Robenheimer. Now, Professor Robenheimer is from the University of Sydney, an expert in nutritional ecology and the author of Eat Like the Animals and the Nature of Nutrition. We've got Dr. Matt Flavel. Now, Matt is Innovation and Science Manager at The Product Makers and explores the reuse of food waste, including sugarcane processing. We've got Dr. Bianca Lay, who is the Executive Director of Cellular Agriculture Australia, who's an expert in cell biology and, of course, cellular agriculture. And our final panelist is Sarah Gauci. Now, Sarah is a PhD candidate at Swinburne University and is doing research into how the diet impacts cognitive skills. An incredibly talented lineup. So let's hear a little bit about what they're working on and some of their thoughts about food. But I'll start also by, can you add into the mix, please, what is your favourite food and your research? Let's kick off with David.
Oh, thanks, Julian. So I'm, as Julian said, I'm a nutritional ecologist, and not many people know what a nutritional ecologist is. A nutritional ecologist is somebody who studies the science of nutrition from an evolutionary and ecological perspective. So really the things that we're interested in nutritional ecology is how do animals interact with their environment via nutrients and foods. And it's a two-way interaction. So the food environment and available nutrients obviously influences the animal, but so too do animals influence the environment, the broader ecological environment within which they interact. And of course, an excellent example of that is our own species. And that's one of the things we will be discussing at length today, I think, is that two-way interaction. How is it that the foods and nutrients in our environment influence us, our health, our cognition, our happiness, and so forth? And then the other side is how do our dietary choices and production methods and broader societal choices around diet impact on our environment? So that's what I'm studying at the moment is human nutritional ecology, or one of the things that I'm studying at the moment is exactly that set of questions there. But I didn't start that way. I started studying insects in the laboratory. I spent, for the past 35 years, I've been studying a very wide range of animals, both in the laboratory and also in the wild in their natural habitats. Starting with insects for my PhD back in the early 1990s at Oxford University, and then moving on to other animals in the lab, and also, really importantly, getting out into the wild and trying to understand what happens in a more natural context. So I'm very interested in that balance between the highly controlled situation that you can establish in laboratory studies, where you can really disentangle the mechanisms and the causes of behavior and responses you're seeing, and then how realistic they are, how they play out in the wild. A lot of my work on wild animals at the moment concerns primates, primates in their natural habitats. And one reason for that is because they're relatively easy to watch. You can get amazing records, detailed records of what they do throughout the day. But the other reason is they're closely related to my main research interest at the moment, which is human nutritional ecology. The question that I've asked across these years of research, the thing I've been particularly interested in is how is it that every other species around us has this remarkable capability to select a balanced diet without diet books, without diet calculators, without dietary science. They just get it right instinctively, and yet our species goes so tragically wrong in that regard. And I think we'll speak more about that as the evening wears on. The questions and also the answers to that question.
Thank you. Let's hand over now to Matt to hear about some of the things you're working on.
Yeah, so thanks for that, David. I think we've actually got quite a lot in common, because that's probably a similar background to what I've really enjoyed, starting small in the lab and then taking it out to how that fits into human nutrition. So I've always been quite interested in chronic disease, is really where I started. So things like obesity, type 2 diabetes is really where I left off. And I started working on a worm model called C. elegans. So I think a big part of my PhD was, this is a great model that they use a lot for genetics. There's a lot of common genes with the human genome, a lot of disease work done, and a lot known about this worm. Unfortunately, from a nutrition point of view, it just eats bacteria. So in terms of looking for food, it's not a lot of interest for human nutrition. So a big interest for me is helping make this a better human nutrition model. And so that was a lot of my sort of PhD research, was making that happen. And so once this model was starting to work quite well, I turned my attention to the wild plants and insects that grow in Australia. And so I collected a lot of different specimens, especially from around an Indigenous community called Kiwakura, probably the most remote Indigenous community we have in Australia. And using this model, we identified quite a few compounds that are actually quite preventative for obesity and type 2 diabetes. So, you know, a lot of the time it's spoken about with things like obesity and diabetes. What are the things in your diet that you should be having less of to have less diabetes and obesity? So I was quite interested in what are those, is there any compounds that actually help preventing these conditions? And so that through my research, I was able to identify some. And then, strangely, that's also led me to work on a plant that really gets a bad rap in nutrition, which is sugarcane. So one of the real reasons it gets a bad rap is sucrose, but actually a lot of people don't realize the other compounds that are in sugarcane, the actual plant, have a lot of value. So I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do now with our research, to see how can we extract that value and add it into, say, something that goes into our food supply, that goes into food and beverage, or that we can feed to animals, or we can put into other things like cosmetics. So I know we're just talking about food tonight, but that's probably my real interest. How can we reclaim some of that value and put that back into our food systems for health?
That's great. Thanks, Matt. And now let's hear from Bianca.
Cheers, Julian. I've got my sister's home brewed beer with me, so thanks, Di. Shout out to her. Hi, everyone. I am a cell biologist. So for most of my career, I've been looking at the cells in human bodies to understand how they contribute to diseases like chronic kidney disease and heart failure. I've then made a pivot in my career to look at the cells in our food in this very exciting and emerging industry and research field called cellular agriculture. And for those of you who don't know, it's a new industry dedicated to producing animal products. So that can be food like meat, dairy, eggs, even biomaterials like leather or wool, more sustainably and ethically. So, for example, instead of growing an entire chicken, which is a very resource-intensive process, instead of growing that entire chicken and only eating the thigh or the breast tissue, we can grow those parts directly from the chicken cells, the muscle cells. This whole process is more sustainable, ethical, it's better for our health, it requires no antibiotics compared to conventional animal agriculture. And I've been really interested in this field because it is such an effective way to solve some of our world's most pressing challenges, like climate change, like biodiversity loss, failing human health, antimicrobial resistance, zoonotic diseases, the reason why we are talking over a video call rather than in person. So last year, during the pandemic, I founded a nonprofit called Cellular Agriculture Australia in order to promote this very exciting industry and research sector right here in Australia.
That's great. I like the idea that we're going to solve climate change and the pandemic all during this webinar tonight. So that's an ambitious target. Thank you, Bianca. Sarah, yourself.
Hi, I'm excited. I'm very excited about this panel. I'm kind of a little different from the rest of the panel. So I have a background in psychology, and I'm interested in how what we eat impacts our weight. So one thing that we all pretty aware of is how our food impacts our physical health, our well-being, and our sort of things like our cardiovascular health. But I feel less is known about how what we eat impacts our cognitive health and our brain. And this is a big problem in today's society because we have an increasing elderly population.
Sorry, Sarah, we're having a little bit of issues with your audio. We'll come back to you in just a second. We'll just let you fix that one. Sarah's work is all around looking at the way that the diet can improve cognitive skills as part of her research, and has been doing a lot of time in the labs doing cognitive testing on people throughout her PhD. So we've got a great panelist lined up for tonight. We would love to hear your questions. I'm going to remind you, now it's your chance. You've heard from us. Now it's our turn to hear from you. So can you please think of what your biggest question is about the state of food? Go find your way into the YouTube comments and plug them in right there. Now, I'm all right with you guys asking tough questions for these scientists because I'm not the one answering the questions. So go hard. I think really test them, push the limits, and make sure you ask the question that you want answered. So there's already a couple starting to flow in, which is fantastic, and we'll make sure we get to as many as we can tonight. And as a reminder, you can also tweet about this using the hashtag PintAU21. So let's dive into the very first question, which is, what do you think the problem, that one of the biggest problems is that we have with our nutrition and food consumption practices of the moment? Why don't we kick off with David?
Well, I think that there are plenty, but the three major issues that I see are overnutrition or malnutrition. It becomes a single problem. That is overnutrition, undernutrition, and imbalanced nutrition. The impacts of our food system, the negative impacts of our food system on global health. And they're immense, they're considerable. A study in 2019 estimated that what we're looking at is 11 million, globally 11 million preventable deaths a year directly attributed to poor nutrition. That's a very large number. That's 30,000 deaths a day that could be prevented. So poor health is a major issue. The other really major issue, which is not unrelated to that, is the environmental degradation that our food system is wreaking. So it's not sustainable into the future, and future generations will be paying the prices for our food production and consumption practices today. So those are the two issues that I'm particularly
On that
concerned
first one, what's the cause of that, David, about the current state of the food system?
I think in terms of the cause, I think, is that our food environment, our food system has been driven by economic criteria. So it's economic competition that is driving the kinds of foods that are available in different proportions in different places and influencing food environments and people's choices. So what we've got is we've got industries that are designing foods to be competitive in a marketplace rather than designing foods that are going to be specifically healthy to either the environment or to the people who are consuming them. There is change. I don't want to be negative about it. There are indications of change. We're going to have to do a lot more to ensure that that change goes far enough and quick enough to make a real impact that is positive in even slowing the problem, let alone reversing the problem. So it has to do with the way that foods are designed and packaged and sold and consumed to be profitable.
Bianca, you're looking at the future about what some possibilities are. Now, David started to mention the environmental impacts. What do you think the biggest benefit of what your work doing around cellular agriculture really is?
Yeah, at the end of the day, people just want to eat delicious, tasty food, right? So taste and price are two of the most popular factors that contribute to consumer choice. There's also nutrition and environmental factors as well, but at the end of the day, it's all about taste. And so what makes me really excited about all these new innovations in food production is that we can create delicious foods and make sure that they're healthy and better for the environment. And so instead of just looking at creating habitual change and changing human behavior, which is really hard to do, convincing the whole planet to eat less XYZ is a really difficult task. So instead, we've got to look at ways we can make these foods more healthy and sustainable.
Now, health of people is impacted by what you eat. Sarah, do you want to share a bit about some of the work you're doing and what that can actually mean? Still got a little bit of an issue. Do you want to try again there, Sarah? Go ahead. Over to you. Yeah, still a bit of an audio issue there. Now, one of the other questions that have flowed in through the chat is, Anna from YouTube is curious to know what you folks see as the future of eating, technologically driven or ecologically driven. Now, it's a good question because one of the comments there is that, like, you know, what people should be eating is going to be varied, of course, by, you know, what the market demands and what these companies that are trying to, you know, optimize for profits and other things that aren't necessarily either of those two. So Anna says, is it going to be technologically driven or ecologically driven or a combination of both? But if you had to pick one, what do you think it's going to go? Matt?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think people tend to... The technology one's always quite interesting because people have a certain taste that they develop. I think Probably there's a big factor too here that, even following up your last question about what's the big thing that needs to change, is there's already quite a lot of food wastage in the world that we haven't really touched on. And I think that's going to be probably somewhere where we need to head a bit more of how we can better use the food that we've already got as well. So I think that's going to play a factor into it also.
Bianca?
Yeah, completely agree with Matt there. So as I said, people want to eat really delicious foods, and you see that with countries where the economy is growing, people are eating more, not less, animal products like meat. And so price is going to be less of an issue. It's going to be based on cultural shifts. So yes, I love this idea of utilizing every part of the vegetable, every part of the animal. You see that coming up a lot in even fine dining restaurants. So yeah, it's all about, how do we make these foods delicious, and as a byproduct, that'll help save the planet, that'll help improve our health, as well as the food waste issue.
Did you have a thought on that, David? Technology or the environment? What's going to shape the way we eat in the future?
I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think technology is going to play a massive part in it. It will have to play a massive part in it, because by 2050, we projected to have a global population of 9 billion. That's 2 new Indias between now and then. So we get diminishing ecological opportunity to produce foods at the same time as we're getting dramatically increased demand for food. Technology already plays a massive role at every level in industrialized societies, in the global food system. And I think it will continue to do so, and that will become intensified. The real question is how we use that technology. If we use it smartly to benefit what food's supposed to be for, and that is for health and for well-being, and also for health and well-being into the long term, in other words, ecological sustainability.
So look, some things have more of an ecological impact than others. I think it's pretty well known that meat has a bigger footprint than vegetables. So I'm going to merge a couple of questions here from the comments that have come in. Nihor on YouTube asks pretty blatantly, so should we all be going vegan? And I'm going to merge that with another question that says, in the future, what role will meat play? Will we look back on it after, down the line, like we do smoking now, or could it even become illegal one day? All right, who wants to take that one? Should we become all vegan? Now, I don't think your answer is going to be yes, Bianca, but let's hear you out.
Look, for the past 30 or 40 years, scientists, environmentalists, animal activists have been begging the public to go vegan. Everyone knows the environmental and health consequences, and even the animal suffering that comes with eating meat. Has that really changed human behavior? Not really. So again, we've got to look at how we produce the meat, not necessarily encouraging the entire planet to become vegan. I think the comparison with smoking is great. But, at the end of the day, there are still a lot of people who do smoke. In answering your second question, I don't want to speculate, but I do think there'll be trends towards eating foods that don't create harm on the planet, people, or animals.
David, should we become vegan?
There are 2 questions here. I'm going to answer the second one first, and that is, will we become vegan? The answer to that is no. So I think to attach a should to that is fantasy. I think there's no way that the global population will do that. So we've got to be smarter than living in a kind of utopian delusion that everybody's going to stop eating meat, and find smart ways of producing meat, both in terms of meat alternatives that are less environmentally impactful, but also in the way that we produce meat agriculturally. So there's a wide range in terms of the impact on the environment of production methods, even of beef. I think we've got to be really smart in selecting those options that have less impact on the environment. And also we've got to aim at reducing the consumption of meat. It's not a question of stopping it altogether. It's a realistic aim to reduce the consumption of meat globally, and that will make a huge impact on the environment in itself. So smart ways of producing it and reducing reducing the amount that we eat is the way that I see it, rather than stop expecting the people will stop eating it altogether. Some will, but not everybody will.
One thing that question made me think of is that idea of, will meat be made illegal, or at least very much culturally unacceptable? In one sense, I think it kind of has happened in the types of meat. For example, it's no longer culturally acceptable to eat wild animals, to eat food that was quite relatively common, things that have now become our pets. We're almost converging on a very small number of animals that we do eat or do find culturally acceptable to eat. So, yeah, is that list gonna change, or will
It's an interesting question. Yeah, interesting question, I think, too. I mean, it's probably worth noting, too, some organisations like the Meat and Livestock Association are committing to becoming carbon neutral by 2030. Perhaps if that becomes realistic, maybe it will be the kinds of meat, not so much the species, but the way that they're actually raised, that will become more. Already you've seen it happen with free-range eggs and some things like that, that there is a shift in that the actual management practices rather than narrowing the species. And who knows, depends how long away we're talking about. But I think it's an interesting comparison you're drawing.
And how can they become carbon neutral when this thing inherently has a lot of carbon in it?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one. I think farmers really will want to change. At this stage, they're going to actually be the ones who are going to be affected by climate change quite early in their business. So I think that they want to change. There's a bit of an issue. There's a lack of tools. Then in terms of actually strategies to mitigate, they're few and far between. Actually, we're trying to work on some with sugarcane at the moment. We're looking for funding if anyone's giving some out. But I think one of the interesting aspects too is that farmers don't actually have a way to measure things like methane on farm, that it's often done in research farms. So there's quite a disconnect between what happens in research and what's happening in commercial level. So I think giving farmers those sort of tools to have that positive change, I think will be a big step towards that goal if we ever get there. But the clock is ticking.
I'll push back again, but like if something which is inherently producing a lot of carbon, how do you get it to carbon zero? Or is the idea that you just offset all the bit you can't do?
Well, I think that's worth doing, offsetting, but I think actually mitigating in terms of, there's been a lot of progress in the actual, strategies to reduce how much is going out. But I think all industries, I mean, there's a tricky line to draw here too. You don't want to just have it that you get to pollute as much as you like and then you can offset it somewhere else. It doesn't matter. But I think ultimately that kind of, it's not going to be a silver bullet one, we're going to get the cows actually putting out no methane. But I think that if there's a way to drop back at every point along that supply chain, that's what we've got to be pushing for, I think.
Do you want to flex on this, Bianca? What's the carbon saving on a bit of lab-grown meat compared to a belching cow?
Yeah, so currently there are no companies, it's such a new field that there are no companies that are actually producing this to industrial scale yet. There are about a handful, less than 5 companies producing this at a pilot scale level. But there have been a lot of modeling, a lot of life cycle assessments to determine how much land, water and energy that this production process takes. And it is predicted to use a lot less land. You don't need much space to make this happen. All of the proliferation or growth of cells happens in bioreactors. So think like a brewery and you're having tanks or vats to brew beer, you can have the same for meat. If you use solar and renewable energy, that's obviously offsetting a lot of the carbon footprint. And finally, water. So water can be recycled if we get engineers to design these bioreactors in a really environmentally friendly way. So as I said, it's modeled to be a lot more sustainable, but at the moment we don't have exact numbers of by how much. And it will vary depending on the species, the cell type.
That's the outside. Now let's look inside. Sarah, food affects how you feel and what it does to you. How does food, how does meat impact, how people's well-being and their day-to-day life?
Well, what we eat has a really important part of our cognitive health as well as our mood and well-being. So one thing the research is showing us is our food and what we eat influences our risk of developing things like Alzheimer's disease. And this is a big problem as our current population is getting older. So the future of food is going to play an important role in trying to reduce the amount of people developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Because the current pharmacological interventions for these type of diseases are not showing to be really effective. So there is a push in looking at ways we can prevent or reduce the amount of people developing these disorders. And one easy way that we can do that, as you mentioned at the start, is food, because everybody has access to food. And with all these growing new ways of research into lab-grown meats and all these exciting areas, food science is really growing. So if we can tap into the health benefits of food, so increasing the nutritional value of food can help its cognitive effects as well. So something that we know about the current diet is it's a high-calorie diet, the Western style diet that we're eating, but it's nutritionally poor. So if we can try and change that and make sure that everybody's getting all the nutrients and meeting all their needs, we can try and reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease as people get older.
So a question, thank you. A kind of question to expand on that, as well as to ask David as well, and kind of all of you to push back against some of your work, right? You guys are at the cutting edge of this stuff. But David asks, why are modern humans so bad at selecting foods compared to other animals in the wild? And were we better in the past? Whether we look way back to when we were hunter-gatherers or more recent communities, didn't we used to have this somewhat figured out? Have we gone in the wrong direction? Why don't we start with David and then come back to Sarah?
Well, humans actually, all of the animals that I've studied are really very good at selecting a balanced diet, and humans are no exception. We have the same biology, and we've shown in our research in experimental settings that humans too have an amazing ability to select a particular balance of macronutrients in the diet. And macronutrients are very, very important from so many perspectives, and those are the nutrients that most of the animals that I study are good at selecting. And the way they do that is they don't have a single appetite that makes them hungry for food or not hungry for food. They have separate appetites for different nutrients. They have a specific appetite for protein, for fats, and for carbohydrates, separate appetites. Those are the macronutrients. And then they also have appetites for two micronutrients. One is sodium, salt, and the other one is calcium. So what we've shown is for macronutrients, humans, like all the other species, select a balanced diet. The reason that the mechanism they use is that these separate appetites are the body's way of telling the animal or the person what it needs at any given time. So it's not just eating food, it's targeting its selection with a specific combination that satisfies the body's needs. The problem with humans is not with the biology, but it's with the environment. What's happened is that we've refashioned our food environments and our food system in a way that these nutrient-specific appetites are exposed to mixtures that they never evolved to deal with. And any of the species that I study that are non-human end up in the same position if you place them in an artificial food environment. And we're living in an artificial food environment in the sense that in Australia, for example, 50% on average of calories come from highly processed, ultra-processed foods that aren't real foods at all. These are mixtures that have been designed by food engineers and manufactured from raw ingredients that aren't foods, but they're actually the extracts of food. So they're chemical mixtures that have been designed and formulated not to benefit our health, but to target those appetite systems in order to get us to eat more and to buy more of those specific products. These are the commercial drivers of the food system that we live in. So there's nothing about our biology that stops us from selecting a balanced diet when our biology is in a balanced food environment that consists of natural foods we do as well as any other species does.
Great comment. Now that what people crave and what they eat. Sarah, would love to hear what that means for people as they do make their choices. But what's the current state of the science in what we should be eating or could be eating for cognitive benefit?
Well, thank you. So currently, it's the evidence shows that it's pretty straightforward. We need to be eating more fruits and vegetables and less processed foods, refined sugars, refined carbohydrates. Really interesting with the new research coming out about the relationship between the gut and the brain is that we should be increasing the variety of foods. So increasing as many different types of fruits, vegetables and grains seems to play an important role for the relationship with cognitive health and well-being.
Now, Matt, we're going to come to you now. Question here from C. Lackhart Thompson on YouTube, who says, "Hey, Matt, I heard you work with sugarcane. What is special and nutritious about sugarcane?"
Yeah, it's interesting. It actually flows in quite well from some of these other comments too about the, looking at that sort of complexity of food. So I think what often happens now, we don't really like to use the word waste. It sounds like it doesn't have value, but what often happens during sugarcane processing is that you'll have, it's all about getting the sucrose out. And so coming into David's point about that is very true, that the food industry has really looked at what, tastes good or has a nice texture. And probably what we're trying to do is be at the front end of actually adding something back into, we're often working with processed food, but actually adding some of these, antioxidant polyphenol compounds that maybe will give some benefit into food that can be sort of consumed en masse. So that's really what we're looking for. When we're talking about what's special, it's what's often left behind. What's interesting about, when you find fruits and foods that come with high volumes of things like sucrose, which is just saying, that can have, damaging effects on health, these other compounds are often pre-packaged there in nature. So I think that's really what we're trying to do with looking to sugarcane, which is, often spoken about as the real villain of the food industry. What else is in there that maybe we've sort of evolved on that might support health? So it's an amazingly complex plant. So I think that's why I think we're able to work on different issues like methane mitigation, like diabetes, even though we're just using one plant. It's sort of like a paint palette that allows you to focus on different aspects of, those sort of projects we can be working on.
I'm going to ask you a tough question, Bianca. These folks have just said, hey, one of the issues with the modern diet is this world of processed food and food that's optimizing for kind of production more than the consumer. Aren't you trying to create the ultimate processed food?
Well, honestly, the cultivated meat that will be produced via cellular agriculture is biochemically identical to the meat that we eat today. The only difference is the way that it's being produced and the fact that we have complete control over what we put in it. So there's only so much we can do to selective breed and produce all these cows that have the perfect marbling or nutrition or whatever kind of factors you're aiming to get. With cultivated meat, we can make sure that there are certain levels of saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids to make sure that we've got maybe even omega-3 fatty acids in a steak, ensuring that there's a lot of protein and other nutrients that you typically would not find in meat. So we can make this product as healthy or as delicious as we want it to be. Having said that, the benefits of this technology are not inherently built in the process. So we've got to make sure we've got all hands on deck, really good scientists and engineers and food scientists involved to make sure that we are producing a really high quality product. So yes, you could definitely produce a very fatty and unhealthy steak through cellular agriculture. But yeah, making sure that we have complete control over the process means that we could create whatever we want, really.
So a great answer there. Like, I really like that kind of complexity. This stuff is never simple and straightforward. Now, In First Person on YouTube asks you, Bianca, so how far away are we from having lab-grown meat on our plates? And part B is a question that I don't understand because they're smarter than I am, which is, and can it be grown without relying on animal-derived cellular culturing media, such as fetal bovine serum?
Sure. So I don't want to speculate and say it will be on, Coles supermarket shelves in the next 5 years.
Everyone, she said 5 years. Put it in the calendar, the 24th of May, 2026.
About every year for the past 10 years, people have been saying, yes, it's coming out in about 2 years' time, and it's still not out anywhere in the world except for Singapore, which is really exciting. They've released a chicken made from cultivated meat, and you can buy that at one restaurant in Singapore. In terms of the second question, so when cells are growing in the body, they need a lot of nutrients. So they need proteins, sugars, all the typical things that we need when we consume food. It's no different when we're growing these cells in a bioreactor. They need essentially like a Gatorade, so a serum or a media that contains all these growth factors and nutrients. Typically in cell culture, we use what's called fetal bovine serum, which is a component that you take out of calf blood. Obviously, we don't want to be extracting blood from a calf in order to feed these cells. That completely defeats the purpose of this technology. So there are companies that are focused on developing this Gatorade for the cells that don't rely on this fetal bovine serum.
And a follow-up, because my interest is piqued. Tell us about the Singaporean chicken. And another question from the chat was, how do you or your industry plan to win over the public who might be skeptical about trying it?
Sure. First question about Singapore. So there is a US company, they're called Eat Just. So they create plant-based egg. They've also created this cultivated chicken meat. They've sold it in Singapore because that's the first country and only country in the world to actually approve of the regulatory process. No other company is at the stage where they're ready to do that yet, except for this one. So you can buy it at 1880. It's a fine dining restaurant, and it's served as an entree for, I think, about $24. So the average price of an entree at a nice restaurant. And what was your second question?
How are we going to convince the world that...
Sure. Yeah, so things like this, Pint of Science is how you engage with the future consumers of any new technology. Science communication is so crucial. We don't want to be going down the same route as GMOs and vaccines. We need to make sure that consumers understand what this technology is, and more importantly, what it isn't. So that's essentially our job. We want to talk to everyone and make sure that people are aware of how this works and what this product will actually look like.
Great. So let's take a bit of a different look. Now, one of the questions here. All right. I think Harshath has a very good point. Why is it that when we speak about the future of food, we speak a lot about meat? Meat is not the only food causing climate change. And does this reflect the over-reliance of people on meat, or is there a gap in the research and thinking? I'll chuck that over to anyone who's got some thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because we've actually just recently done an analysis of the impact of processed foods, highly processed foods. And when I say processed foods, I'm speaking about ultra-processed foods. Food processing is a very good thing. All sorts of benefits to doing it, but not all forms of food processing. Ultra-processing is the form that I was referring to earlier, where foods are resynthesized from chemical ingredients like extracted starches and fats and so forth, rather than made up from pre-existing food. So I'm speaking about ultra-processed food here. Those are the ones that are so damaging to health. And we've done an analysis recently showing that they're also very damaging to the environment. And one reason that they're damaging to the environment, of course, is the packaging that comes with them. They're heavily marketed in packaging and distributed that way. But the other reason has to do with my work on appetite systems. Humans, the strongest of the appetite systems in humans is the protein appetite. What that means is that when we select our diet, we select a diet biologically to satisfy a specific protein intake. If we dilute that protein with something like fats and carbohydrates, then what happens is we will eat more of the dilute food in order to get the same amount of protein. So we will overeat the things that are diluting protein to reach that target protein intake. And this is what we've shown is happening in these ultra-processed foods, is that they are diluting protein relative to fats and carbohydrates, meaning we eat more of them, which is beneficial, of course, for marketing. But we're also overeating fats and carbohydrates that are having an impact on the environment. We're eating the same amount of protein, so protein isn't driving it, it's fats and carbohydrates. If you eat meat, it can be a more intensive way, environmentally intensive way of generating protein, but we don't eat it in nearly as large quantities as what we're eating those over ingested fats and carbohydrates, each calorie of which costs water, costs global greenhouse gases, costs transport to produce and distribute. So I think that's a very good question. The impact on the environment has to do with the specific properties of the food, but it also has to do with the amount that is eaten. And the worst outcome is eating in excess that impacts on health, but also impacts on the environment. And that is the situation with highly processed foods.
That's a great comment. Sarah, is there something that you think isn't being questioned or thought about or researched enough in this space?
Sorry, just
You there, Sarah?
just trying. Oh, perfect. I think I was just trying to unmute. Took me a while.
Sarah, the question is,
Can
what?
you hear me now?
We sure can. What do you think is one of the topics that isn't being given enough airtime in this world of what we should eat and why?
Really following on with what David said, currently there is a lot of research about how it can impact our cognitive health, and unlike its impact on the environment, we're seeing that meat should be sort of eaten in moderation or less than in moderation. It seems to have a positive effect on cognition because of the high amounts of B vitamins and omega-3s seen in meat and seafood. But one area that needs more research is those ultra-processed foods. So it's a really growing area of research that's coming out, and we know very little about how those ultra-processed foods are impacting cognitive health and brain health. I think there's one study showing that ultra-processed foods increases the risk of things like depression. So it is very plausible that our Western style diet, which a key factor is a high amount of those ultra-processed foods, is contributing to an increased amount of Alzheimer's disease that we're seeing. So from my perspective, finding ways that we can improve the processing of food to not remove so many of its nutrients that are so important for brain health, but also have a more environmental, less of an environmental impact, is probably the way to go, and more research needs to be done in this area. And it's something that I'm hoping to look at as part of my PhD. So looking at those ultra-processed foods and how they impact the brain.
That's great. Now, I've got a good question here from Tim on YouTube, who says, how come when we add chemicals, preservatives, processors, transportation, like fast food, does it become more affordable and then more appealing to society than more raw, stripped down, healthy food, which seems more expensive often? Why is that, Matt?
There's a few things going on there. So why is it cheaper to do it that way? Look, I think it's some of what we've touched on is that actually some of those very natural ways of making food are quite expensive. And one of the main reasons is actually the kind of unrealistic expectations we have on some of that food. And again, coming back to that food waste issue, is I think that's a really big issue that, you know, we've actually got quite good at trying to reduce waste in our own home, but most of the food waste is actually happening on farm based on those sort of expectations we're having. So that really can drive cost up a long way, is that consumers aren't willing to have a messy food that is across the spectrum of the end product. When you do some of these things to control processes, and you're actually able to, that's very attractive to consumers, that you get a very consistent product that is affordable. And that has been the sort of mechanism over a long period of time that has been the way to get that product. So look, it's not a straightforward answer, but I think it is sort of a sped up evolution of product development that's led us there.
So on that, do you think consumers need to change, or the industry needs to change to do these things? Because I can only buy what's available at the supermarket, so I don't really have any choice what's sitting on the shelf there. But then is the industry saying, wait up, people wouldn't buy this if we did put it out there?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think consumers are very hard to change. That I think that's what's happened is it's that evolution's been driven by trying to supply something to consumers they really want. So I think probably that's what there is. Now that there is more attention from consumers on certain aspects like sustainability, that might allow some change to happen. But I think relying on the consumer to change will be difficult. But I think, like Bianca was saying before, communicating the value in other aspects of the food, I think, is probably where we'll get change that will work across the board.
So a question to you and then to the whole panel is, so how can we feed the world as a question, can we feed the world with the current conventional farming techniques? And, with this kind of waste question, how much are we producing, and how is it best to cut that down?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. At the moment, we're wasting a third of food. So we have enough food now for 10 billion people. So yes, we can feed the world, but not at our current consumption rates. So I think David was saying before that, we'll need, at our current rates, we'll need a second landmass the size of India. So, the equation doesn't balance at the moment. So I think that's going to be the role of innovation to improve, and it will be multifaceted. It will be improving efficiency. It will be new technologies like, lab-grown meat, but it won't be limited to one of those areas. And I think it will also include more efficient cows. I think that even though there are these other opportunities, I think if we're actually going to feed, more of the developing countries that are very reliant on small farms, if they're not running efficiently, there will be some challenges that won't spread to the rest of the world.
Look, agriculture has clearly gotten orders of magnitude more efficient. It used to be something that almost every human did was get food. It's now a very, very small part of what humanity does as far as like people spending their time. Bianca, do you want to chime in on that, on providing for all and reduction in waste?
Yeah, I completely agree with Matt. There's no single silver bullet that's going to solve this problem. We need innovation in science, in the way the policies and how we regulate the way we produce food. We need more science communication to ensure that people understand where their food comes from. There is no single way to solve this problem. But yeah, as Matt said, we already produce a lot of food. We're really good at doing that. So yeah, there's a lot of different great solutions, and cellular agriculture is one way we can make sure that people can still eat meat without feeling guilty about it.
Great. So Anna Spataru on YouTube says that as an interest and recommends we all look more into regenerative agriculture. So when agriculture becomes a carbon sink. Thoughts on that as a field? I'll chuck it open to anyone.
So one really important component of that would be to develop crops that are perennial, so that they maintain the root stocks in the fields, and also they continue to photosynthesize not only at a certain time of year, but across the year, so they become standing sinks for carbon. And there is work taking place on this at the moment, which seems to me a very promising way to go forward. Of course, it's just one of many possibilities. On its own, it's not going to solve the problem, but every significant innovation will make a worthwhile contribution. And that is an important one as well because of soil. Soil is, of course, it's the lifeblood of agriculture, and current sort of annual farming practices are really heavy on depleting soil. So they require things like fertilizers to be added, and they're breaking the ecology in a much more acute way than perennial crops would. So that's one suggestion.
Look, we're getting close to time, so I want to hear from each of the panelists. So get thinking. What do you think the standard diet, let's say standard diet maybe for Australians, will look like in 50 years? That's 5 decades. So that's more than your 5-year prediction, non-prediction, Bianca. What is going to be the standard diet in 50 years? And what do you think it should be? So what do you think it will be? What do you think it should be? Why don't we kick off with Sarah?
That's a bit of a tricky one because I'd like to think that we'd be eating healthier in 50 years' time. So I'll start off with what I think it should be. So I think it should be a diverse diet, hopefully higher in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, foods that are obviously being found to have cognitive benefits. But what I think it probably will be, and hopefully with the science, we'll be able to keep the nutritional value, like the work that Bianca is doing, will probably be these foods that are processed in labs, but with the nutritional benefits of the processed foods with the sort of nutrient profile of whole grains and whole foods.
Thank you, Bianca.
Yeah, it's so hard to predict. There's going to be so many novel
There's going to be so many.
So some of it would be, you see this huge trend of eating insects because they're a great healthy source of protein. Looking at algae, I really love this idea of if we do continue to eat a lot of meat, then using other parts of the animal, not just the muscle. There's so many other components of animals that we just waste. And obviously, cultivated meat will hopefully be a huge part of people's diets in moderation. Of course, everything should be done in moderation. But yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of really exciting new food adventures for our population in 50 years' time.
Do you really think it'll be significantly different, or is this hopeful thinking?
Well, you see, what were people eating about 30 years ago? People were eating aspic and all sorts of weird things that we absolutely do not eat now, especially in Australia where, we're a foodie nation. We want to eat foods that are more exciting, more innovative, better for the planet. And there's just so much research going into it now. I can't imagine that all this innovation that's happening now won't affect people's diets in 50 years' time.
I think it's a really good point. Like, our diets definitely have changed. It's become more global, absolutely more food influencers. I think, people have become a nation of foodies. And at the same time, Vegemite and Coca-Cola, I think, were going strong 50 years ago and maybe going strong in 50 years. David.
Well, I'm going to be honest and say I do not know for the future. But what I can say is that we're at a critical tipping point right now where the situation significantly calls for some kind of action, and the future of food is going to depend on how effectively and what kind of changes we institute in the system to reduce the impact of on the environment and also reduce the impact on human health. So one scenario would be that as Sarah was saying, we have a healthier, whole food, diverse diet in the future. The other would be that we have an increasingly highly processed, impactful on health food, a diet based on increased high ultra processing of foods, and there's some intermediate between the two. Which of those three we achieve is going to depend on what we do now as a society. And that's not, we spoke about consumers. Of course, consumers play a very important role in this. We've spoken about government. They play an important role in this, and we've spoken about industry. And the only way to forge the best future possibly is for those three groups of society to work together and decide as a society what kind of a diet do we want to be eating in Australia and globally in 50 years' time.
It's a great comment about all of the stakeholders and how it all ends up. Matt.
Yeah, it's interesting. Probably a lot of what the other panelists have said really resonates, especially not really knowing. 50 years is longer than I've been alive, so knowing what people eat in that amount of time will be tricky. But what I think in that amount of time, what I would really like to see is our actual understanding of the interaction between our nutrition and our genes might progress to the point where there isn't an Australian diet, where there is really a personalised diet. I think personalised nutrition's got a lot, a lot of benefit for a lot of the things we've talked about around health and that sort of thing. I think there's a little bit of way for the science to go, but maybe in 50 years we can have, just a diet for Julian or a diet for Bianca, and I think that could be, whatever we're actually eating, if it's optimized to the actual person, I think that would be a really step forward for nutrition.
Look, that's a great comment. I do think my diet could be improved. I think dim sims and pale ale isn't the ideal ones. I've got some tweaking and some levers to twist. Folks, what a great set of questions and what some wonderful answers there throughout the session tonight. Look, we're moving towards the end of this session, but there's some great stuff coming up as part of Pint of Science. So if you're at home, what you should do right now is crack open your phone or your calendar of choice and put the following things on it, because there are 2 more Pint of Science panels coming up. They're on Thursday, the 27th of May. We've got 2 ripper topics. So one of them is that we're going to discuss how the unique Australian wildlife is holding up against climate change and the changing environment in the panel called Fight for Planet A. Now that's happening on Thursday, the 27th of May at 6:30 p.m. And then we're going to switch our focus to the complications that come along with modern day life's fast and digital kind of approach, what we're doing right now. And we're going to try to evaluate what it means to live in a world where decisions are being made by machines, when algorithms and tech giants have all of our data. And that panel is called Ethical Considerations in the Digital Era. Incredibly timely, both of those topics. Now that one is at 8:30 p.m. So tune in again on Thursday. You can even do back-to-back Pints of Science if you like. So put that in the calendar for Thursday. Now, Pint of Science is a community volunteer organisation, and I would love to thank all of the Pint of Science volunteers who have done such a huge amount of work, particularly in the last month or so, to put all of these workshops together. In particular, I'm going to send a lot of love to the small team of the Pint panel organisers for really making all of this run well. Incredible talent that people have gotten to bring these things to life. We all love science. We're all committed to doing interesting things for the benefit of the world. So, folks, now this is where there's an ask. Because Pint of Science is supported by volunteers. And if you are able to, we would love it if you could make a donation on the Pint of Science website to help us keep these events running. Now, there is on the screen, as you can see, a QR code, which we didn't know how to use 2 years ago, and now they're kind of second nature. So pull out your phone and load that up if you can, because it's really important that not-for-profit community organisations get the support that they need. So if you can you please make a donation? We really do appreciate it. It's a tough time to get sponsors. It's a tough time to get corporate supporters. So any help that you can do actually goes a really, really long way to helping us spread the message of science and science communication to a mainstream audience. Now, I know you folks are keen beans that are watching this, but we'd love to tell our story far and wide. Now, look, we're getting close to the end, so I would love to thank the panelists. Can you please make a lot of noise in your home? We're not all together in a pub, so you're going to have to shout really loud, bang on the floor. Your downstairs neighbours aren't going to mind. Do a bit of that, do a bit of this to please thank our panelists. They're incredibly talented scientists and individuals. And thank you, our audience, for coming along. This is a community event. It's not about us talking at you or to you. It's really about a dialogue and a conversation. So I'm going to just call out some names from people that chucked out good things in the chat. Most questions we got to, some we didn't. So shout out to Rahul and Tim and Harshath and Anna and Alice and many more who asked some fantastic questions and made this a really wonderful and engaging event. So yeah, go on, give yourselves a clap. I think that's totally fine. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We really love to share science and science communication. I just thought we'll open it up to the panel. Is there anything that you need to plug or promote? Have you got a movie that's coming out? Have you got a book deal? Is there anything we should know about before we wrap it up?
Who are you asking? Us, the panelists.
The panelists, yeah. Anything to spruik? Otherwise, these guys can find you on LinkedIn. You're all very searchable, very Googleable. If you've got nothing to plug, then I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a fantastic event. Have a wonderful night, everyone. And that's it from Pint of Science.